Hi everyone, and welcome to another webinar in our winter series. Today I'm honored to introduce Dr. Grace Halden. Dr. Grace Halden specializes in reproductive health, reproductive technologies, assisted reproduction, including IUI and IVF, donor conception, and bioethics as represented in literature and culture. The work is interdisciplinary, situated at the intersection of literary studies, creative nonfiction, and medical humanities. The current award-winning research project, Cyborg Conception, explores cultural responses to donor conception, solo motherhood by choice, and assisted reproduction. Grace also serves as the program director for the MA in Medical Humanities and co-director of the Center for Medical and Health Humanities at Big Buck University. Welcome to our webinar, Dr. Grace Halden.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction. And thank you for welcoming me to the Literature and Science Forum. I'm very excited to be here. Yes, as stated, I am an academic working across the literary studies and medical humanities. This year, of note to this talk, I published a book with Palgrave called Cyborg Conception, Cultural and Critical Responses to Solo Motherhood by Choice. And this book came from a larger award-winning project called Cyborg Conception, which has been funded by Birkbeck, Wellcome and the Experimental Humanities Collaborative Network over the last 4 years. And some of the books, some of the themes from the book will be covered today in this talk called Cyborg Reproductive Rights and Assisted Reproduction. And broadly, I'll mainly be thinking about new family formations and how they have been represented in our culture. I'll be thinking about how assisted reproductive technologies have changed, how human conception, pregnancy and family is being narrated, and in doing so, consider the ways in which assisted reproduction and assisted reproductive technologies are impacting how we might think about the cyborg in the contemporary. So to narrow the talk, because it's obviously a very huge subject matter, I'm going to be focusing on solo motherhood by choice, which refers to people choosing to become pregnant, birth and rear a child as a single parent through gamete donation, which usually means sperm donation, can also mean egg donation as well, and embryo donation. So before we get started, I want to share some different quotes. So 4 different quotes, which I think say some diverse but interesting things about solo motherhood via donation and cyborg conception, which is a term that I will explain later. So if you're a bit confused about the term, don't worry, I'll get to it, but I'll get to it about 15 minutes in. So you need to persevere slightly. These quotes I'm going to share with you now will run through the talk and will have different significances as I progress. The first quote on the screen is from bioethicist David James Velleman, who is openly opposed to donor conception. And he writes, "First comes love, then comes marriage, and then the proverbial baby carriage. Well, it's not such a ridiculous way of doing things, is it?" And here, obviously, we have the promotion of heteronormative nuclear family construction as the ideal child rearing environment. For Velleman, interventions such as donor conception is immoral, and therefore there is a suggestion then that certain members of our society ethically should not reproduce. The second quote is from Laura Seftel, who writes on reproductive loss. Seftel reflects on reproductive crises and its traumatic impact. She writes, "The loss of one's dreams of having a child in a particular way, or of having a child at all, is perhaps the most invisible in a range of reproductive crises, and yet it can be the most consuming of time and emotional energy. Studies have shown that the stress levels of people struggling with infertility are equal to the stress experienced by patients suffering from AIDS or cancer." And the next quote is from the fiction novel Breastnegs, which reads, "She wants to get pregnant, and she can, so she should. Just because she's not with anybody doesn't mean she has to give up on having her own baby." So in this story, the protagonist experiences what we might call social infertility, which means the traditional route to conception is not viable to her. And consequently, to conceive a biological child, she seeks a sperm donor. And this line from the novel acts as a counter-argument in many respects to Velleman's bioethical stance and provides an opportunity for the protagonist to tackle the sort of reproductive crisis as outlined by Seftel. And finally, this quote is from Donna Haraway and comes from her Cyborg Manifesto published in the 1980s. I will soon argue that the choice to conceive solo through donation could be interpreted as an act of cyborg conception, with Donna Haraway's understanding of the liberation of cyborg. Haraway writes that, and I quote, cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves. So each thinker is saying something different, very different about ideas of reproduction, family, and identity. And these four overlapping ideas will remain in our minds as we go through this talk. So to structure this talk, I'm going to work through four broad questions. How does the solo mother clash with single mother stigma? What criticism still exists? And to really look at that, I'll be focusing on literature, fiction primarily. What is cyborg conception, and how does cyborg conception challenge traditional norms? So on this slide, we have some basic statistics to underscore why I'm using solo motherhood as a case study in this instance. So since the founding of Single Mothers by Choice organisation in 1981, there has been a significant shift in societal attitudes towards reproductive technologies, enabling more women to pursue solo motherhood. Today, donor conception accounts for 1 in 170 births, highlighting its growing role in family building. Notably, 50 women ordering donor sperm from the Cryos Bank are intended solo mothers to be, reflecting a deliberate choice many are taking to embrace single motherhood from conception. This trend is further reinforced by an 82% increase since 2019 in the number of single parents using IVF and donor conception. Now, at the start of this talk, I presented some conflicting cultural interpretations of this phenomenon, and I'll return to them now. So on one hand, we have literature like Breast and Eggs portraying a positive interpretation of the solo motherhood pathway as representing liberation, reproductive freedom and strength, as underscored by the quote, she can get pregnant and she can, so she should, that she shouldn't give up on her ambition to have a baby because of her circumstances. But then on the other hand, we have bioethicists like David Velleman who argue about the selfishness of donor conception, underscored by promoting the idealistic way of having children within a heteronormative framework. But even though I'm highlighting Breast and Eggs as a good example of fiction that looks at the solo motherhood phenomena in neutral or even positive ways, it actually is in a minority of texts supporting donor conception and solo motherhood. In fact, the vast majority of texts that look at solo mother donor conception are decidedly negative. So I've just got three texts on the screen now. The one on the left should read The Good Life. I've slightly cut that, so apologies for that, but it's called The Good Life by C.L. Halden. This particular text, we have a scenario in which the donor recipient, so the solo mother to be in the book, she becomes pregnant through sperm donation and then discovers to her horror that she has inadvertently been caught in a illegitimate practice of donor recruitment, in which the sperm has been illegally sourced from a celebrity through an act of medical rape. No, no, don't worry. Typical things with technology, isn't it? Don't
Yeah.
worry.
My internet should be good, so.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, so just turning to look at Headlock again. So it's a young adult novel that focuses on the donor conceived child in this scenario, but the mother chose donor conception really selfishly and very recklessly, and was a very negligent and absent mother that created a very toxic child-rearing environment for the child. So there's very heavy on the dystopian portrayal of solo motherhood here. So overall, I'm only giving you a couple of examples here, but in chapter 4 of my book, I look at a lot of literature, and we tend to see a pattern of presenting solo mothers in fiction as reckless, ruthless, selfish, negligent, or if they're not, they tend to be reinfolded into heteronormative family structures. I was going to give you some examples from TV and film as well. So number one on the screen is an episode from Silent Witness. A solo mother was murdered. She was pregnant with her donor conceived child, and she was murdered. And on the mortuary slab, the detectives are sort of ethically debating her choice of being a solo mother. Again, donor conception is articulated as a very seedy practice. Her donor is called Frank the Wank, and he becomes like a leading suspect in this episode. Number two, Parks and Recreation. In this scenario, donor conception is pursued quite lightly. It seems to be a very spontaneous decision. The donors on offer are given nicknames like Little Douche and Suadan. These are very bad options for the recipients. And in the end, because all the donor options available to her were so poor, she has a baby with her boyfriend. So again, she's kind of reinfolded back. Number three is a backup plan. Again, it features donor conception, but as you can probably tell from the picture, she goes on to have a romantic relationship. They get together as a couple, and she then goes on to have a baby within the heteronormative family structure. Number four, donor conception is portrayed as a bit of a lark, not really seriously thought through. So the recipient, the solo mother in this case, she has a conception party, and her known donor arrives at the conception party to provide his sperm for the insemination that will happen at the party. And her male best friend switches the donor sperm with his own, gets drunk, forgets about it, and she conceives her best friend's baby. Now, obviously, this is a massive portrayal of trust. It's rape. It's horrendous practice. She discovers years later that her son is the biological child of her best friend. But they get into a relationship, and again, she's reinfolded back into that nuclear family structure, despite the huge betrayal that led to the conception in the first place. Number five, The Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, so titled, is an egg donor. And in the example of number six from Working Mums, we have two donor conception storylines for solo mothers, but in both scenarios, they both find partners during pregnancy. These partners become committed relationships by the time the baby is born. And in one example, the partner becomes a stay-at-home father, rears the child while the mother can return to work. And in that situation, the working mum is able to continue to be a working mum because she's found a co-parent. So again, she's not only being reinfolded back into the nuclear family structure, but she is essentially being saved through that act and able to continue her lifestyle as she wanted it to be. So not that finding a relationship is a bad thing, but there is a tendency to portray a relationship as a fix-it for this unconventional pathway and the only route to a happy ending. And outside of fiction, we also have problematic representations in the media as well. I'm just going to give you one example, but I do provide more in the book also. So here we've got a headline from the Mail Online, which reads, "I was so desperate for a baby, I had sex with the world's most notorious sperm donor, and it worked." So here we've got a focus on sensationalism and the negative aspects of unregulated donor conception. And obviously, I think it is designed to elicit some sort of judgment in the reader. So there is a lot of stereotyping, and this largely comes from a historical stigmatization of the single mother. The reason, arguably, for the poor portrayal of solo motherhood in literature and culture is because of this ongoing stereotype of the single parent family being a problematic figure within society. This has got very old roots. So here on the screen, you can see some images from mythology. The demonization of the single mother has been referenced in texts since antiquity. For example, in the Greek hymn to Apollo, in which the Olympian king and queen, Zeus and Hera, compete to create offspring solo, Zeus produces the wise and the beautiful Athena, but Hera produces Hephaestus, who is described as monstrous. As Daniel Ogden argues in his article on fatherlessness in ancient Greece, the message here seems to be that a mother can only produce misshapen monsters on her own. There are also numerous references to the monstrousness of single motherhood and the threats the single mother poses to married couples. And one such example can be seen in the Jewish legend of Lilith, the first wife of Adam, who refused to submit to her husband and left Eden. Alicia Ostreicher notes that Lilith attempts to seduce men and that she slips between a man and his wife to steal drops of his semen and make demons from it to plague mankind. Ostreicher also mentions that traditional households sought to protect themselves from Lilith. And I think it's possible to see here how solo mothers can be read as connected to the demonized Lilith. Difficult, independent women who resist marriage, the procurer of sperm, the creator of illegitimate children, a woman who poses a risk to the traditional nuclear family ideal. But moving forward, looking at more contemporary concerns over single motherhood, we can see in the quote on screen that the single mother is often linked to dysfunctional child-rearing environments. And I quote, "In comparison with others, single parents are disadvantaged in terms of income, education, health prospects, and career opportunities because the great majority are women, they face patterns of gender disadvantage. The children of single parents are more likely to live in poverty and are less likely to do well at school." As Ross Park notes in Future Families, often single mothers are viewed stereotypically negatively. And I quote, "The public perception of single mothers as poor, impulsive, irresponsible, and unfit for parenthood is widespread. Many assume that they are an economic drain on the state and collect welfare to survive." Jane Jaffa notes in her historic overview of the treatment of single mothers, an unwed mother with an illegitimate child was considered ruined and suffered hellish treatment. Hell hath no punishment like the treatment given to a fallen woman. And Ruth Siddall notes that single mothers are often demonized as the enemy within, reflecting that mother-only families were considered to be dangerous and an underclass, with single mothers viewed as virtually irredeemable, lazy, dependent. So if single motherhood has traditionally been viewed as accidental, lamentable, and as something that has negatively and circumstantially happened without choice, often the attitude seems to be in contemporary literature is, why would a woman choose to do this when it is so problematic? Why would you intentionally create such a problematic family structure? But in reality, research shows that solo parents via donation families are not inferior to traditional families. Now, I can't go into too much detail here because of time restraints, but I do look at quite a lot of research in the book. But just to focus on one sort of dominant researcher, Susan Gollenbach, her work over decades has shown that, and I quote, "Children born through reproductive donation are by necessity planned, and there is evidence to show that planned pregnancies are associated with more positive psychological outcomes for mothers and children." This research is supported by other reports. For example, Ross Park argues in Future Families that many single mother families are functioning well and their children are thriving in spite of the clear departure from the ideal family form. Now, for some bioethicists, the problem of new family structures like solo parenthood is the convergence of non-traditional child-rearing models like fatherless families, as well as the development of reproductive science that enables such constructions. However, as I shall now argue by looking at the idea of cyborg conception, assisted reproductive technologies can not only represent reproductive freedom, but a way to move beyond restrictive binary understandings of family and self. So on this point, I'm going to turn again to one of our starting quotations, and that is Donna Haraway's. And I'm going to remind us of this quote. She writes, "Cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves." Donna Haraway wrote the Cyborg Manifesto in 1985. She concluded her essay with the now famous line, "I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess." And if we look at the historical framing of her article, we can see some interesting connections to Haraway's push against goddess ideology. A year before Haraway's article was published, the psychiatrist Jean Boland published Goddesses in Every Woman, A New Psychology of Women in 1984, in which she presented her Jungian-inspired theory that women can identify in their behaviour and psychology the symbolism of ancient Greek goddesses, including the great Mother Demeter. Boland's work responds to an increased attention at the time to what was called goddess worship in the 1970s, or goddess feminism. And indeed, the goddess was read by some feminists in the 70s and 80s as a push against patriarchal systems and a shift towards feminist spirituality. And an example of that is seen on the screen there on the right in Women's Spirit magazine, which ran from 1974 to 1984. However, despite the fact that Boland did reject the stereotypical reading of women as acceptable, like, maid and wife, mother, or unacceptable, like, whore and shrew, she still connects women with the idolatry of the goddess, and therefore the inference that there is somewhat a dependency on the god. In fact, as I noted a few moments ago, women don't tend to come on particularly well in mythology. And so a year after Boland's publication and the termination of Women's Spirit magazine, Donna Haraway declares that she would rather be a goddess. So I'd rather be a cyborg. That was actually quite a profound error. She would rather be a cyborg. That's the whole point. She was pushing against the goddess ideology. She was looking at what was happening at the time. She doesn't want this. She would rather be a cyborg. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means to her in a moment. But what is also interesting at this time, at this moment in which there was rejection against the goddess and a rejection against trying to put women in very compartmentalized spaces, and Donna Haraway arguing for opening up of ideas on self and identity and the ways in which we live in the world. Psychotherapist Jane Mates conceived a son without a partner and started the organisation Single Mothers by Choice in 1981. So this was all happening around the same time. Now, the choice to conceive solo could be interpreted as an act of empowerment for those adhering to both the goddess archetype, as some goddess mothers were solo, and the liberational nature of the cyborg in Haraway's work. But because the solo mother was demonized as neither, so not an idealized goddess and not a feminist icon, and so not a feminist cyborg icon, they fell into this, they could arguably fall into this sort of this juncture in which they were neither a positive nor negative example of parenting. And this is partly because of how the single mother was stereotypically viewed rather negatively in society. Concern over the single mother meant that in this same decade in which Boland and Haraway were writing these very conflicting narratives of feminism, American clinics were officially permitted to offer assisted reproduction, but only 10% of the doctors who performed artificial insemination were willing to do so for unmarried women. So yes, we had this movement. We had the Solo Mothers by Choice movement and organisation established in the 1980s, and it had a long legacy that sort of predated that, but gained in popularity after the birth of the first IVF child in 1978. And we had this call from Donna Haraway for freedom and liberation in her sort of Cyborg manifesto. But it was still very, very early days. And although clinics were able to offer artificial insemination, as I say, most were unwilling to do that for unmarried women. And as an aside, and I'm sticking with the 1980s, but it seems a long time ago, so I'm just going to do a brief aside to show that these issues remain still quite urgent. It was only in 2008 that the UK law changed and allowed clinics to treat solo women without prejudice. Before 2008, clinics were expected to first assess whether the resulting child would be disadvantaged if raised without a father before they were allowed to offer treatment to solo women. And since the legislative change in 2008, lesbian couples and solo women have been able to access fertility assistance without the assumption at the very start that they will just naturally represent a family that's inherently problematic. And that really wasn't too long ago, 2008. But let's go back to the 1980s. That was just an aside. Let's go back to the 1980s. So this decade was an interesting moment. It was the decade after the birth of Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, the decade in which the Solo Mother by Choice organisation was formed, the decade goddess feminism was peaking, and the decade that Haraway demanded a reimagining of feminism through cyborg politics. So we are here. What is the cyborg? So far I've framed, what the problem was around solo motherhood quite early on, and how it persists to be a problem when talking about the ongoing stigmatization and stereotyping of single mothers. But what was happening in Donna Haraway's thinking, and why am I using cyborg and cyborg conception as a way to perhaps push against some of these stigmas? So the cyborg is often described as a hybridization of biology and technology. That's perhaps the easiest way to understand it. Haraway defines the cyborg as a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, and a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. So she's got three layers to her concept of the cyborg. Now, the importance of the fusion of biology and technology has been a foundational concept in cyborg theory since the coinage of the term in 1960 by Manfred Clynes and Nathan Kline. Today, when the cyborg mother is discussed, she is often described as having a biological function assisted by technology in order to conceive, and is therefore often conflated with the IVF mother. And we can see an example of that on screen by Susie Geiger, who writes, during in vitro fertilization, women's bodies are biologically enhanced and at the same time technologically disciplined, assisted, to make up for any potential shortcomings of their own or their partner's autohuman constitutions. The woman's fertility is manipulated, her organs made transparent, her eggs removed and then reimplanted, her agency and sexuality stripped away. The cyborgification they underwent will have left its traces, good and bad. Even without the extreme of intrauterine insemination and in vitro fertilization, conception is now largely presented as mediated. Ovulation tracking apps, fertility supplements, fertility acupuncture, and digital pregnancy tests all frame pregnancy as somehow technologically mediated. Pregnancy is also negotiated through scans, blood tests, Dopplers, and so on. The single mother by choice might use in vitro fertilization or artificial insemination at home or intrauterine insemination to conceive. But to be cyborg, then, we don't need to embed chips and wires into our bodies. We just need to be significantly influenced by technology. On the matter of the cyborg, Haraway writes, the boundary between the physical and the non-physical is very imprecise for us. And I think this is true for solo mothers by choice, as somebody who has physically conceived a child through the fusion of sperm and egg, but also represents the non-physical reality in which the resulting child is not two parents, but of one. And there is an important distinction between gamete provider and father. To have a fatherless child might seem to be an oxymoron, but as Bostwick notes, the cyborg is nothing if not a mass of contradictions, both real and imagined. I interpret the cyborg mother as somebody who combines technology, such as assisted reproduction and donor conception, as well as reproductive biology to conceive without a partner. But rather than explore the technicalities of what that means, I'm more interested in what Haraway says about the social reality of the cyborg and how thinking about the cyborg can help us articulate how we can bypass the limitations of heteronormative framing in reproductive discourse. Haraway notes a cultural shift from a focus on family trees and idealized family models to the study of genetics, populations, diversity, and evolution. And the single mother also represents a shift in how the family is conceptualized by disabling traditional reproductive processes. Assisted reproduction contradicts dualism surrounding conception, pregnancy, and child rearing, and so chimes with Haraway's belief that cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves. Freedom from restrictive binary understandings of self is why, as a feminist, Haraway explains that she would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. So arguably, what I think is happening with solo motherhood by choice and donor conception and other non-traditional family forms is not just the utilization of technology into an organic process, which is cyborg, but the intentional act to move against binary convention that says family is and should be made by a mum and a dad. Although the cyborg can be viewed as a symbol of liberation and freedom, the continuous demonization of women reproducing outside of a pair-bonded dynamic means that people are actively being encouraged not to exercise control of their reproductive function. And this is why Haraway's shift away from goddess identification and towards the freedom of the cyborg is so important. The struggle for representation of the solo mother by choice in fiction represents the struggle that comes with any type of writing on the cyborg. For Haraway, cyborg politics is the struggle for language, struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication. And this is very true for the solo parent via donation who will struggle to communicate. Will struggle to communicate the complexity and binary defining nature of conception and family formation. So, for example, they might struggle to articulate without challenge that their family does not contain a father, but instead a genetic provider. In the novel Breast and Eggs, we follow the journey of Nasuko, who has no interest in romantic relationships and decides to conceive solo through donation. Her friend Rika supports her decision, saying, if you want a kid, there's no need to get wrapped up in a man's desire. There's no need to involve women's desire either. There's no need to get physical. This novel is unusual, for it represents solo motherhood by choice as a legitimate form of family planning without lamenting the problem of the lack of nuclear ideal. Haraway also writes that cyborg writing is about the power to survive, not on the basis of original innocence, but on the basis of seizing the tools to mark the world that mark them as other. In Breast and Eggs, Nasuko actively seizes the tools offered by the fertility clinic and uses them to help her achieve her goal of donation. Achieve her goal of donation-assisted conception as a solo mother, despite the fact that her clinic refuses to treat unmarried women and attempts to mark her and her lifestyle as other. So she seizes those tools that are working against her, and it gives her power to become the person that she wants to be and form the family that she wants to have. So I'm just going to wrap up now. So there might be an instinctual rejection of the term cyborg and a suspicion of its application because it can sound quite scary. It can sound like an abnormal or a monstrous or a natural title. And this is not what I tend to convey. If we think of cyborg as an abbreviation for boundary breaker, then I think it becomes less jarring. The cyborg for me is three things: mediated by technology in some way, influenced by certain scientific and technological advancements, even if only environmentally, and a philosophical concept in which traditional boundaries fall under scrutiny. And this understanding has been shaped by research since the 1960s on the cyborg as the ability to be free to explore, as extending human limitations, as a hybridization of organic and technological, as the influence of an increasing technological society, and I think most importantly, a creature of social reality who is paradoxical through challenging established binaries such as natural and unnatural. So when I define cyborg conception, I refer to an intentional application of technology from DIY insemination kits through to IVF to mediate and assist the biological act of reproduction. Specifically in this talk, the use of donor gametes and the establishment of a paradoxical single-parent family from conception. And I view this as cyborgic in the respect that sexual reproduction and dual parenting norms have been disrupted. Cyborg conception can enable women who, for a variety of reasons, wish to or need to conceive without a co-parent. And it enables them to procreate when ordinarily this would not be a possibility. Now, although Haraway and I, we disagree on many elements of the cyborg and on reproduction, we do find agreement in how the cyborg represents freedom from restrictive binary understanding of self and freedom, and allows us to move beyond antiquated stigmas and stereotypes which have demonized women's non-traditional family setups for centuries. Now, I'm not proposing that the solo mother by choice will call herself cyborg or consider herself post-human. But what I'm intending with this word is to think that the cyborg is not something that is socially disruptive, visually sensational, or apocalyptic, but is something that is readily happening and almost naturally happening. It's us to rethink restrictive ideas of family and parenting and kinship in very important and positive ways. Susanna Graham argues that solo mothers by choice do not pose a threat to nuclear family models, but instead are reworking their ideas about motherhood and relationships in an aim to salvage at least some of the nuclear ideal they had imagined for themselves. But contrary to Graham's analysis, I suggest that solo mothers by choice are not trying to salvage some nuclear ideal, but instead represent a new type of family formation that exists beyond binary parameters that mark heteronormative parenting structures. The one-parent offspring of a solo mother by choice reflects the social and imagined reality of solo parentage, even if this contradicts a biological reality. While for Haraway, we are all cyborgs, we are all chimeras, for me, the solo mother at their most ironic, conceiving solo, is the ultimate example of cyborg conception by refusing seductions to organic wholeness. And I'm dead on 40 minutes, so I will stop there.